I may not live to see our glory, but I will gladly join the fight. And when our children tell our story, they'll tell the story of tonight. Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, the abolitionist, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Hercules Mulligan, the tailor's apprentice, are all at their favorite tavern, and they're there to talk about the coming revolution. Each recognizes the risks involved. We may not live to see the day when the colonies are free of King George III and Great Britain, but they are committed to the cause, no half measures. Their hearts and minds are fully joined with the revolutionary spirit sweeping the colonies. Raise a glass to freedom. Tonight, we're here to plan, to support each other, and renew our resolve to get this cause moving. Tomorrow, we will fight and possibly lose our lives in the coming battles. But freedom is worth that price if we must pay it. And if we are destined to make that ultimate sacrifice for our cause, let's remember this time together. Let's let those who will come after us know the depth of our commitment we have made to the cause of freedom and to each other. This night, it is a moment of celebrating common cause and remembering the burden they are taking on with the potential cost to each of them. In a much earlier time, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and his disciples are gathered to celebrate the Passover together. For some time as they travel together, Jesus has been telling his followers, I will not live, I am going to die. To a person, they have refused to believe what he's told them. The disciples and the other followers of Jesus are still looking to the day of revolution when Jesus will lead a rebellion that will reclaim control of the government at Jerusalem. They look forward to that day of triumph and glory in a new government led by Jesus. The disciples have been unable to hear or to comprehend Jesus' message about another form of kingdom and that he would soon die. Now, gathered around the Passover meal, he again reminds them, I will not live, in fact, it will be one of you that betrays me. In the story we hear every Maundy Thursday, we know that each of the disciples asked, surely not I. After following him throughout his entire ministry, one wonders, how is it possible that one of them could even think of betraying him to the temple authorities and the Roman occupying forces? Is it me, Jesus? How is that possible? Peter goes as far as to say, no, Jesus, I'll gladly join the fight. I will defend you to the death. Don't go there. But Jesus has to disappoint Peter and tell him, no, you won't, Peter. No. Instead, before the rooster crows twice tomorrow morning, you will have denied me not once, but 3 times. The story of that night is a difficult one. And if it ended there, it truly would be an unpleasant history for us to relate. But it didn't end there. Jesus continues speaking with the disciples. When you look back and remember this night and this last Passover meal that we have shared together, he takes bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he shares it among you. the disciples, and he tells them to do the same thing. Take your bread, bless it, break it, share it with yourselves. Remember this night and the sacrifice of my body that I will make for you. And once they have shared the broken bread together, he lifts up a cup of wine. He blesses it, and passing it to them says, raise a glass to freedom, a freedom granted you as the new covenant in my name. This is the cup of salvation that I will pay for with my life. My body will be broken. My blood will be shed. Out of love for my Father, Abba, for you and for many, I gladly take on this fight against evil. But remember this night. Remember my sacrifice as often as you meet together. Tell the story of tonight. As you gather at table to share food and drink, remember me. Tell my story to your children and the generations after you. Never let your children and grandchildren forget this night. My sacrifice, the offering of my body, my life, and the new covenant that will be established with God as a result, is something no one can ever take away from you, no matter what anyone tells you. So raise a glass to freedom. Raise a glass to liberation from sin and death. Raise a glass to the reconciliation of humanity with God. Raise a glass to the memory of that sad and solemn night so many centuries ago. It is this story of that night that we celebrate and we commemorate when we celebrate communion. In the Gospel of John, we read, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. When we celebrate the sacrament of communion together, as we will this morning, we rehearse some portion of that salvation story together. In today's celebration, we will recall the time the disciples wanted to send the people away to find their own food after they had been with Jesus for a long time. But Jesus tells the disciples, have the people sit down where they are. They need not go away. You give them something to eat. That gospel lesson of the feeding of 5,000 reminds us today that we are our siblings' keepers. Don't send them away. Don't ignore their hunger. Don't ignore their homelessness or their lack of a job or their inability to make a reasonable living. You give them something to eat. You provide shelter for them. You help them find a way to get a job. You advocate for a reasonable wage. To authentically tell the story of tonight, to be a true follower, a true disciple of Jesus, is to take up our cross, to follow Jesus' example. And that, forgive me for saying so, seems to be a most un-American way of living. In an article titled, How a Plague Exposed the Christian Nation Myth, a pastor by the name of Jason Bradley wrote this. At Jesus' birth in the incarnation, Jesus laid aside his divinity to identify with humanity. And at Calvary, he laid down his human life to make reconciliation with God possible. In both actions, laying aside his divinity and taking up his cross, He renounced his rights. In a culture and economy that operates on consumption and acquisition, it's difficult to convince Christians to renounce anything. In fact, quite often when American Christians are asked to give up something for the sake of others, it is interpreted as persecution. One doesn't have to search hard for stories about churches who continue to meet and still continue to meet against the recommendation of authorities, even when it puts people at risk and lives are lost as a result. It's strange, he writes, excuse me, but nothing reveals the rot at the center of American Christianity like the response people have had to wearing masks. It requires zero sacrifice to put a mask on, but that's still too much of an ask for many Americans. Mask wearing is really the perfect litmus test for self-denial. It's something we do for others. My mask protects you. Your mask protects me. It's not only a legitimate way to stop the spread of germs, but it also communicates our care for others. It's such a low bar for denying oneself, and yet there are people all over this country who refuse this small act of solidarity. Their discomfort and inconvenience is too big of an ask. Yet, Jesus asked us to take up our cross and follow him. Following him looks like self-sacrifice. He is our model, and we are his followers only in as far as we actually follow him. I can imagine many American Christians reading and listening to this and saying, Jesus chose to make a sacrifice. I'm being expected to. I should have the freedom to choose how to carry my cross. But let's not forget that Jesus suffered the indignity of an unfair trial in a kangaroo court. The religious authorities were looking for an excuse to kill him. His life was taken from him. He was lynched. His attitude of self-sacrifice was a preparation for a final act of genuine sacrifice that he was prepared to make. But it wasn't like he walked into Pilate's office, slammed 3 nails down on the desk, and asked to be crucified. He was ready for the ultimate sacrifice, but he didn't want it. He prayed for God to spare him that fate. Following Jesus' example, every one of his disciples stoically endured horrible treatment from officials and their countrymen. But they had renounced the expectation to be treated fairly. They didn't take up swords and demand their rights. They modeled themselves after their leader, Jesus. My dear friends, as we remember the story of tonight, this morning, may we rededicate ourselves to being authentic followers of Jesus, looking to love our God above all, and remembering to love our neighbors as ourselves. Then we can live the story of tonight. Amen.